Number 10. Grave robbing. Probably the most infamous crime of the time, and today really. The ancient Egyptians were many things, and that included vain. There's a reason why they got Elizabeth Taylor to play Cleopatra. It all makes sense. The pharaohs of Egypt were buried with immeasurable amounts of treasures. Gold, gems, jewels, swords, cats, dogs, just about everything but the kitchen sink. Once the tombs were sealed, the treasure was also sealed in there forever, or so they thought. That wasn't until some crafty thieves broke into the tombs and slipped away with the loot. When a lot of Egypt was being discovered in the 1920s, it was unsure if the loot had been taken 10 years ago or 1,000 years ago. There's not really a way to know. And yes, it still happens to this day, and yes, it's awful. Leave it in there, it belongs to them, please. No more, no looting, don't go looting, please. Number 9. Bribery. Given that Egypt was one of the greatest civilizations the ancient world ever saw, it makes sense that they had it all. Currency, law, order. However, sometimes these things just don't mix. Ever seen Better Call Saul? Yeah, exactly. They had a good system for the time, and it was fairly concrete. However, like concrete, over time, there's little tiny cracks that form, aka bribery. Oftentimes when facing serious charges against the pharaoh, there was an option to opt out of your sentence. Just open your wallet and dish out some cash. This has worked in ancient Egypt, medieval Europe, 1920s America, and today. Say what you will, but the almighty dollar does have buying power. Number 8. Unaliving. If women of the evening partake in the world's oldest profession every night, then unaliving is the second thing we ever did. It's not really a profession, but we've been doing it for a long time. It's pretty sad, but it's true. Sure, it's always been frowned upon, but today we have a lot of rules, laws, and regulations regarding said rules, laws, and regulations about unaliving. It's bad, don't do it. It was unfortunately more common than we think back in the day, especially amongst royals in ancient Egypt frothing at the mouth for the throne. But this is something that could have happened to anyone. Plus, in a time before CSI and guys throwing off their glasses to make very obvious low-hanging fruit jokes, well, if you didn't see the crime, then you probably wouldn't catch the crook, so people kinda just got away with it sometimes. Not all the time, but sometimes. Number 7. Assassination. Related to my last point, nothing is true, everything is permitted. The creed of the assassins, and one of my favorite video game franchises, at least up until they did Pirates. After that, it was all kind of downhill after that. Well, despite the inaccuracies of the Assassin's Creed series has, like falling from great heights into bales of hay, the first known assassins just may have started in Rome and Egypt. More likely Egypt than spread to Rome, actually. Like a Sith, a lot of these early assassinations were for revenge, personal ambition, power lust, especially in the pursuit of success. Some were even part of larger plans. It's one thing to be violent, sure, but to organize the destruction of a dynasty through the means of your knife, well, it's amazing what a couple inches of steel can accomplish. Who goes there? Someone's knocking on the door? We're good. Okay, anyway, sorry. Number 6. Treason. Law and order in Egypt were associated with something called Mahat. I believe that's how you say it, which refers to truth and justice within society. Like I said before, great idea, great start, but more often than not, the ancient Egyptians had to fight off a lot of treason and corruption. More than they like to admit it. Like when King Ramses III chose the heir to his throne, and well, it wasn't who his wife had picked out, so there was gonna be problems. There was a lot of wives, sons, and breeding. There's confusing lines. So, in order to get what she wanted, she was going to stab him in the back. Literally. Well, her plot was unfoiled, and her and all the conspirators were immediately unalived as punishment. There wasn't even a burial service, as they were all thrown in the river afterwards. No amount of money or bribery could save them there.
Number 5. Marie Antoinette. So France's queen between 1774 and 1792 was Marie Antoinette, who was, the last queen before the French Revolution. She had quite the reputation for splurging on expensive things and found herself in quite a few scandals. One in particular was the affair of the diamond necklace. So Countess de la Motte, a young lady, pretended to be the queen's friend and entered the French court in 1785. She fooled a high society member into believing that Antoinette loved him. She even hired a buy-selling worker and disguised her as the queen and convinced the man that Marie wanted to purchase a diamond necklace. The jewelry cost around 1,600,000 livres then, which is almost $12 million today. The money was never paid, and the queen had no clue about what had taken place. But even though she was innocent, the public still despised her. Granted, she's mostly known for her infamous dialogue. When French subjects could not afford bread, she said, "Let them eat cake," which fueled the French Revolution and ultimately led to her execution. Number 4, Queen of Castile. So Juana la Loca was the Queen of Castile from 1504 to 1516, and she suffered from various mental disorders. After her husband passed in 1506, her father buried his body. However, Juana used to open the tomb and caress her husband's dead body, and ultimately she ordered the body dug out and kissed her husband's feet. Additionally, she would carry his coffin everywhere with her, and actually kept it under her bed. Years later though, she eventually allowed his burial outside her window. Look, I just keep weird dolls under my bed. Number 3, Maria Eleonora of Brandenburg. Maria Eleonora, born on November 11th of 1599, passing eventually on March 28th of 1655, held the title of Queen of Sweden from 1620 to 1632 as the wife of King Gustav II Adolf. Coming from a noble German family, she belonged to the prestigious house of I'm not even going to try and say that. However, when Maria and Gustav gave birth to a girl with a genetic condition causing excessive hair growth, Maria was deeply shocked. The unexpected appearance of her daughter, combined with societal beauty expectations, pushed Maria to her limits. She considered her daughter ugly and refused to care for what she perceived as a monstrous creature. When Gustav died when Christina was only, this many years old, Maria blamed her for his death. For over a year, Maria subjected Christina to very harsh punishment, confining her to blacked out, darkened rooms to mourn her father in solitude for very extended periods, even placing her father's open casket in Christina's room and demanding she sleep next to it, which that's way too morbid. Even by my standards. Maria's mental state deteriorated, eventually leading to Christina's removal from her custody. So, thank goodness for Christina. Number 2 is Sixty the Dragon Lady. So the story of her rise to power is a remarkable one. Born at a time when Chinese women were politically invisible, this lady managed to acquire enormous political influence by exploiting her position as a royal concubine, engaging in court intrigues and manipulating those around her. By the end of the 1860s, she had become the most powerful individual in China. Her will and her reach even exceeded 2 male emperors, who she frequently bypassed or overruled. Now, she was originally born Lan Kuo in 1835, the daughter of a minor Manchu official, and at age 15 she was selected as a potential concubine for the emperor and relocated to the Forbidden City. She was elevated to the status of concubine officially by age 18, eventually giving birth to the emperor's only son, Zechun, a feat that earned her another promotion in the palace hierarchy. The emperor died in 1861, and shortly after the disastrous Second Opium War, left the throne to his only son. So as the mother of the reigning emperor, Cixi was given the courtesy title Dowager Empress. So by this point, the empress had become quite adept at manipulation, palace intrigues, and power games. Through forged evidence and false testimony, she engineered the arrest of the 8 ministers, 3 of whom were later executed. With the regency council gone, the empress became the de facto regent for the duration of her son's reign, until his early death from smallpox in 1875. The empress was instrumental in the succession, choosing her young nephew Zetian, who was crowned as emperor. So once again, this Dowager Empress acted as regent to the infant emperor, this time in a more formal capacity. 12 years into the young emperor's reign, our empress moved to the summer palace in Beijing, and surrounded by a network of informants and advisors, doted on by loyalists and conservatives in the bureaucracy and military, she continued to exert enormous influence on appointments, policies, and matters of state. Stories of the empress's extravagance are prevalent, since it has been claimed that she regularly increased her personal and food allowances, that she withdrew gold and silver from dwindling national reserves, and spirited millions of pounds offshore into bank accounts in London. Other tales of her exorbitant spending include her decision to spend 10 million silver taels, some set aside to rebuild the Chinese Navy, on the renovation of one of her palaces. Another rumor claims that 3,000 ebony boxes were needed to restore her jewelry collection. Number 1, Agrippina the Younger. So Julia Agrippina, also referred to as Agrippina the Younger, was a Roman empress from 49 to 54 AD, the 4th wife and niece of Emperor Claudius and the mother of Nero. After the death of her first husband, Agrippina tried to make shameless advances to the future emperor Galba, who showed no interest in her and was devoted to his wife. On one occasion, Galba's mother-in-law gave Agrippina a public reprimand and a slap in the face before a whole bevy of married women. She was one of the most prominent women in the Julio-Claudian dynasty, functioning as a behind-the-scenes advisor in the affairs of the Roman state via, the powerful political ties. She maneuvered her son Nero into the line of succession, and Claudius became aware of her plotting, but died in 54, and it was rumored that Agrippina poisoned him. She exerted a commanding influence in the early years of Nero's reign, but in 59 she was killed. Both ancient and modern sources describe Agrippina's personality as ruthless, ambitious, violent, and domineering. And that brings us to the end of our time, and I'm glad that, even though I'm part vampire queen, I just bully people. I swear I don't execute folks for fun, and not just because I'm not allowed to. Draining people of their redness, though, well, that's another story.
It might be too clever to talk about Lizzie Borden as a pun, but I'll ask you guys about that later. Sorry. Anyways, Lizzie Borden was an American woman who was tried and then later acquitted for the axe murderers of her father and stepmother in Massachusetts. Lizzie was very religious and would go to church and do church activities, teaching Sunday school, etc., etc. 3 years later, after her mother passed away, her father remarried to Abby Gray. Lizzie didn't like Abby that much because she suspected Abby's goal was her father's money, and as tensions grew, even more when Andrew would gift real estate to his new family's wife and their stepmother received a house. The night before the murder, their uncle visited their father to discuss property transfer, which placed more tension. After the crime was committed, the police turned their attention to Lizzie as she gave conflicting testimonies within the day, and after many strange occurrences like her cleaning her dress and burning it up saying it was covered in paint, the town's suspicion of her drugging her father to sleep in order to whack him with an axe, overall the evidence was unclear and caused many controversial issues. However, the trial was later pushed away when another axe murderer similar to her father and her stepmom's case occurred 5 days prior. Still, the reputation of Lizzie and her sister's involvement was tarnished, and the suspecting evidence and accounts of that day remains unsolved. Number 9. Elsa Koch. Elsa Koch was a German war criminal who committed atrocities while her husband, Karl Otto Koch, was commanded at the Buchenwald in World War II. Because of the egregiousness of her alleged allegations, and her actions included that she had selected tattooed prisoners for death in order to fashionably create lampshades and other items from their skin. These are fake, by the way, they're not real. Her 1947 U.S. Military Commission Court trial at Dachau received worldwide media attention, as did the testimony of survivors who ascribed her sadistic and perverse acts of violence to Koch, giving rise to her image as her concentration camp murderesses. However, authoritative testimony from numerous witnesses at her post-war trials firmly established that she had made extensive use of slave labor at the camp, had assaulted inmates on several occasions, and had reported inmates to the camp SS for beatings. Beatings that resulted in death on at least one occasion. While imprisoned, she experienced delusions and had become convinced that the concentration camp survivors would abuse her in the cell. She then ended up taking her own life in jail while serving time. Number 8. Belle Gunness. With an estimated 48 deaths at her hand, Belle Gunness poisoned, bludgeoned, and decapitated her victims, all so that she could collect and line her pockets with savings and insurance policies. This lonely hearts killer was known as Lady Bluebeard, amongst other names, luring her victims with newspaper advertisements. Gunness then began meeting wealthy men through a lovelorn column. Her suitors were her next victims, each of whom brought cash to her farm and then disappeared forever, including John Moo, Henry Galthart, Olaf, Oli B, Andrew, just to name a few. One of the victims' brothers came suspicious, and Gunness's luck seems to be running out. Her farmhouse burnt to the ground, and the smoldering ruins workmen discovered 4 skeletons. 3 were identified as her foster young. However, the 4th, believed to be Gunness, was unexpectedly missing as its skull. After the fire, her victims were unearthed from their shallow graves around the farm. All told, the remains of more than 40 men and minors were exhumed. However, Belle managed to skip out of town before being officially convicted and was never tracked down. Her death has never been confirmed. Number 7. Countess Elizabeth Bathory. I don't know if you've seen the tales of Snow White and how there was this once evil queen who yearned for eternal beauty, but like all fairy tales come from the stem of truth. Countess Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian noblewoman who was an alleged serial killer from the family Bathory, who owned a land in the Kingdom of Hungary. Bathory and 4 of her servants were accused of torturing and killing hundreds of young and old women between 1590 and 1610. During her arrest, it is commonly believed that Bathory was caught in the act of the torture, but the reality was that she was just having dinner. Most of the witnesses testified that she had heard the accusations from others, but did not actually see it themselves. The servants confessed under torture, which is not credible in contemporary proceedings. The accusations of the murder were based on rumors, and as there is no documents to prove that anyone in the area complained about the Countess, in this time period, if someone was harmed, or let's say someone stole something, a letter would be written out as a complaint. Several authors have argued that Elizabeth Bathory was a victim of conspiracy. Similar, during the Salem witch trials, many people insisted that they saw the accused witches of flying through the sky. Clearly neither thing happened and are possibly a form of mass delusion or self-interest lies. Historians are therefore extremely careful in how they treat eyewitness accounts of this sort, given the possibility for collective and self-reinforcing delusions. Number 6. Dorothea Helen Puente. Dorothea Helen Puente was an American convicted serial killer, and in the 1980s she ran a boarding house in Sacramento, California, and murdered various elderly and mentally disabled boarders before cashing their social security checks. She paid each of them monthly spendies, but then kept the remaining for what she claimed were expenses for the boarding house. Puente's boarding house was visited by several parole agents as a result of previous orders for her to stay away from the elderly people and not to handle government checks. Despite these frequent visits, she was never charged with anything. Neighbors began to grow suspicious of Puente when she stated that she adopted a homeless man named Chief to serve as a handyman. She had Chief dig the basement and remove soil and garbage from the property, and Chief then put in a newly concrete slab in the basement before he too mysteriously disappeared. In November 1988, another tenant in Puente's house, Alvaro Montoya, disappeared, and after he failed to show up for his meetings, his social worker reported him missing. Police arrived at Puente's boarding house and began to search the property. They discovered recently disturbed soil and were able to uncover 7 bodies in the yard. When the investigation began, Puente was not considered a suspect, and as soon as the police let her out of their sight, she basically fled to Los Angeles, where she visited a bar and began to talk to an elderly pensioner. The man recognized her from the news, and then he called the police, and she was charged with 9 counts of murder and was sentenced to 2 years of life. She died at the age of 82 and had always insisted all of her tenants died to natural death. Number 5, Candace Elizabeth Newmaker. When you grew up in an unstable home, there are cases, if not most cases, especially if the child is unable to have any rehabilitation of security or sense of safety. The child, psychologically speaking, is, for the lack of a better word, traumatized. After Candace Elizabeth Newmaker's parents were caught for their negligence of Candace and her siblings, Child Protective Services took her away. As a result, she was later adopted by a single woman and a pediatric nurse named Jean Elizabeth Newmaker. But after months of adoption, Candace was reacting pretty not good, and she was very aggressive, according to Jean. She even killed her pet goldfish and started playing with matches. Keep in mind, this was all under the allegation of Jean, as she would also give Candace medication and take her to a psychiatrist due to her reckless behavior. In the year 2000, Jean took Candace to a pseudoscientist by the name of Cornell Watkins, who didn't have a license, to do a 2-week intensive attachment therapy program that cost $7,000. She found this so-called psychiatrist from another licensed psychologist named William Goebel. After 2 weeks, Candace died from the so-called rebirthing session, and the goal of this so-called rebirthing required an individual, in this case the child, to mimic a simulate womb covered by flannel sheets and pillows. Candace was held down by 4 adults, where she was begging and pleading that she couldn't breathe. She yelled 11 times that she was dying, to which the people involved, named Julie Ponder, said, "Go ahead and die right now, for real." After 20 minutes, Candace threw up, excreted inside the sheet, and despite, they still restrained her. 40 minutes after, they asked her if she wanted to be reborn, and she responded no. They yelled at her that she was a quitter, and at the end of the session she realized that she was motionless, her fingertips were blue, and Jean, who was watching the session from another room, took notice and tried to do CPR. They called 911, and when they were able to get a pulse, but eventually Candace died from being brain dead from asphyxia. Considering this was all videotaped, these so-called therapists were sentenced to prison sentences, convicted of reckless child harm. And after that, the US House of Rep passed Candace law in Colorado and North Carolina, preventing reenactments of the so-called birth experience. Number 4, Delphine LaLaurie. Delphine LaLaurie was also known as Madame LaLaurie, who was a New Orleans socialite of French Creole descent who lived in the 19th century. She is infamous for her association for one of the most notorious instances of cruel and harm in American history. So reports suggest that slaves who were owned by Delphi were found in a state of extreme physical harm and torment, as reportedly chained to walls. Others were confined in small cages, and others shown signs of severe mutilation. The exact details and extent of the atrocities vary in historical accounts, with some describing brutal experiments and inhumane treatment. As the news of the discovery spread, a mob of outraged citizens attacked the mansion. However, Delphi and her family managed to escape before facing any legal consequence, of course. After leaving New Orleans, Delphi's exact fate is unclear, as there are different accounts of where she went and what happened to her. The LaLaurie Mansion has also been noted as a haunted house, as ghost stories and legends, as it's also considered to be one of the most haunted places in New Orleans. Number 3, HJSY. If you were in Japan in the 70s, you might know this horrific and tragic story of Junko Furuta. A once motivated, popular, and beautiful high school student was headed home to watch the final episode of her favorite television show, Tombo, when suddenly 4 deviant, horrible high school boys by the name of Hiroshi Miyano, Joe Ogura, Shinji Minato, and Yasushi Watanabe abducted her and took Junko to Minato's home. There, they were extremely violent, as they violated her and allowed other men to violate her as well. From the day of her kidnapping on November 25th to the day that she died on January 4th, under excruciating physical and psychological pain, she was tormented, beaten, lacerated, and even burned. Her appearance drastically deteriorated to the point where she even gave off a rotting smell. After beating and dropping an iron exercise ball in her stomach several times, burning her with hot candles and on her eyelids, forcing her to drink her own urine, Furuta succumbed to her injuries and she died. Less than 24 hours after realizing she had died, they wrapped her body in blankets, shoved her in a body and traveling bag, then placed her body in a 55 US gallon drum and filled it with wet concrete. They then dumped her body in a cement trunk in Tokyo, and after they were caught and convicted for another of kidnapping and physical harm to another woman, the boys accidentally confessed to the crime of Junko and told police where to find her body. She was finally found, and her parents and her classmates and her coworkers found peace, knowing she can finally be buried. But these horrible, crappy kids were only able to get less than a 10-year sentence, and even the mother of one of these horrible delinquents, Ogura, vandalized Furuta's grave, saying that the dead girl ruined her son's life. Which, to be honest, after these guys were released, they ended up doing more crime anyway and got arrested for that. Either way, the tragic crime of Junko Furuta had echoed as one of the most horrible crimes committed in Japan. Number 2, Gamal Pasha, also known as executioner of the Armenian genocide alongside other members of the CUP. During his tenure, Jamal Pasha implemented policies that would lead to the mass deportation and killing of Armenians. He is implicated in the forced marches, massacres, and other brutal actions that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Armenians. Pasha was also a key figure in the executions of genocidal policies set forth by the Ottoman government, and after World War I, Pasha fled the Ottoman Empire, sought refuge in Germany. In 1922, he was assassinated by an Armenian revolutionary named Teheran. Teheran was later tried and acquitted by German court, which recognized the massacre of the Armenians as a war crime. So that's good to know, the German court can recognize genocide as a war crime. Pasha's role in the Armenian genocide is remembered as one of the broader historical narratives surrounding the events of 1915 and 1923, during which the Ottoman Empire systematically targeted and killed a significant portion of Armenian population. The genocide remains as a historical debate, with Turkey officially denying the term genocide to describe these events. However, many countries and scholars around the world recognize that this was a genocide, which, if anything, any nation that has the audacity to eradicate a nation of people by displacing them, cutting off their water, killing hundreds and thousands of their children, obliterating generations of family trees, and literally committing violence on civilians is a war crime. It is a genocide. Finally, number 1, King Leopold. Although he's a king, a lot of people seem to not know that the trauma inflicted this so-called king had as a significant role in Congo. Congo had suffered his horrible and vicious rule as Leopold acquired control over Congo's free state as his private property during the time when European powers were competing for territories in Africa. While officially presented as a philanthropic and humanitarian venture, Leopold's administration in the Congo was marked by exploitation and brutality. From forcing them by using methods of extracting resources that were often brutal, involving the use of violence, mutilation by cutting off their hands and feet by making them also stare at their lost appendages, and forced labor of the Congolese people. The atrocities committed during this period had been well documented, with the estimates of death toll ranging from several hundred thousands to millions. The harsh exploitations, along with the disease introduced by outsiders, led to significant decline of the people of Congo. Villages were ravaged and families were separated, contributing to the long-lasting impact of Congolese society.
Number 10, the oldest profession in history. Alrighty folks, we're kicking off today with a nice dose of internet no words, so bear with me here. If I sound convoluted, you know why. The Middle Ages in Europe witnessed a universal paradox of tolerance and condemnation with regards to the selling of one's body services. While technically a sin because it hinged on the act of fornication, this act was recognized by the church and others as necessary, or a lesser evil. It was accepted as fact that young men would seek out sexual relations regardless of their options, and thus this profession served to protect respectable townswomen from seduction or worse. In 1358, the Grand Council of Venice declared that this field was absolutely indispensable to the world. In general, declarations proclaiming the necessity of this line of work were not quite so enthusiastic. The church didn't hesitate to denounce it as morally wrong, but as St. Augustine explained, if you expel it from society, you will unsettle everything on account of lusts. So, you gotta have it. It just wasn't exactly ideal back then. Number 9, hunting witches. Witch hunters often had their suspects stripped and publicly examined for signs of an unsightly blemish that witches were said to receive upon making their pact with Satan. Now, this devil's mark could supposedly change shape and color, and was believed to be numb and insensitive to pain. And more often than not, women were both the witches and the witch hunters. And in these cases, it was easy for even the most minor physical imperfections to be labeled as the work of the devil himself. Moles, scars, birthmarks, sores, and tattoos could all qualify, so examiners rarely came up empty-handed. If found guilty, witches would be sent through a series of trials and punishments, starting with the skulled bridle. Also known as a witch's bridle, a gossip's bridle, a brank's bridle, or simply branks, this was an instrument of public humiliation. It was an iron muzzle in an iron framework that enclosed the head. Some exceptions were masks that depicted suffering, but not pleasant either way. Oh, you want me to elaborate? Alrighty folks. A bridle bit or curb plate around 5 cm by 2.5 cm in size was slid into the mouth and pressed down on the top of the tongue, often with a spike on the tongue as a compress. Ouchie. It functioned to silence the wearer from speaking entirely and cause extreme pain and physiological trauma to scare and intimidate the wearer into submission. Now, this prevented speaking and resulted in many unpleasant side effects for the wearer, including excessive salivation and fatigue in the mouth. Seeing how I've always been a chatty Cathy, I would have been sentenced to this, and my jaw hurts thinking about it. The wearer was then led around the town by a leash, and for extra humiliation, a bell could also be attached to draw in crowds. It was used as corporal punishment for other offenses, notably on female workhouse inmates, and the person to be punished was placed in a public place for additional humiliation, and who knows what else. I'm sure you can put 2 and 2 together. There's things I cannot say. Number 8, bathing in what now? Aptly named the Blood Countess, Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian noblewoman and was one of the most prolific female serial killers of her time. At the end of the 16th century and beginning of the 17th 17th, she tormented and killed up to 650 young women at her castle in is what now known as Slovakia. The macabre nickname came from her apparent tendency to bathe in the redness of her victims, as she believed it would help her maintain her youthful looking skin. I'll stick to my Epsom salts and the occasional bath fizzy. Oh, and my cleansing routines. Look, I swear my one cleanser from The Ordinary might look suspicious, but it's not human redness. I just play a vampire professionally, folks, I'm not an actual one. Or maybe. Number 7. Serfdom. In most Middle Ages communities, the king technically owned all the land in an area. He would lease it out to noble barons in exchange for an oath of their loyalty, and then these nobles had the freedom to govern their land and impose taxes as they pleased. Yeah, as you can expect, they were pretty brutal about it. This privilege for the few landed barons came at a great cost to the serfs. Now this was the poor mass of people who had no land and no rights. They were essentially treated as slaves by the local nobles, and they toiled on the land and brutally worked 6 days a week from dawn until dusk. Per the feudal system, they were forced to produce crops, raise livestock, and offer some value, to pay their liege lord for the use of the land. And the grind never ended. If you were born into the lower class, it was extremely likely you would remain there for your entire life. There was no social mobility or opportunity to work through one's birth position. Instead, the poor, unwashed masses simply kept working hard and toiling away with no chance of ever improving their lives. If that's not evil, I don't know what is. Number 6. Getting married way too young. Yeah, medieval females obtained the status of married woman very early. At the age of a girl reached the age of majority and was entitled to marry. Now, in this scheme of things, the choice of her future husband was based entirely on her parents' will. No wonder a marriage sanctioned by the law of the church turned out to be a nightmare for many wives. Under civil law, a husband was permitted to moderately physically harm his wife. Actually, a medieval tradition advised a husband to treat his wife as a pupil. So teach her place. So a lot of desperate women, therefore, killed their husbands. The legislation of those times had detailed regulations governing punishment for women who had killed their husbands. They were sentenced to death by burning alive or burning at the stake. Kinda like a witch. Creative, but not really.
Number 5. Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb was in charge of the CIA's MK Ultra project in the 1950s. This project's goal was to investigate techniques that would crush the human psyche to the point that it would admit to anything. I guess in some ways it's kinda like the truth serum, but with psychology. More specifically, he too also wanted to find a way to do mind control like Delgado in number 9. He wanted to find ways with the CIA to induce the behaviors of enemies, but in these cases, Sidney went his way by dosing unsuspecting subjects with LSD, experimenting with illegal drugs, and sought out all sorts of exciting ways to poison people, including Fidel Castro, as he is the man behind the infamous poison cigar. If you guys know Stranger Things, the suspicion of Eleven getting her powers was from her mom being induced with LSD, chemicals that were thought to be creating of powerful abilities, but unlike Stranger Things, it definitely helped open someone's mind up, but not like moving stuff with one's mind. Number 4. Sergei Burko-Honeko. Although he's been credited with helping bring about the most important advances with open heart surgery, his gruesome act was on experimentations on animals, also animal cruelty. Sergei wasn't content with slicing up animals after they died. More specifically, not only did he not like to wait, but he also didn't like the animals to die, even after they've been decapitated. In the late 1930s, him and his team undertook a series of experiments as part of which they removed a canine's head and kept it alive away from its body by hooking it up to an air and blood supply apparatus. He would also have another hound had all the blood drawn from its body, only later to be brought back to life by the Soviet Frankenstein. Number 3. Shiro Ishii, a microbiologist and a lieutenant general of Unit 731, a biological warfare unit of the Imperial Japanese Army during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Ishii is remembered as the father of biological warfare. Under his watch, thousands of captives were infected with deadly diseases and thousands more were impacted by chemicals on the battlefield. Ishii performed a bunch of experiments that had nothing to do with chemical warfare, including forced abortions, vivisections, and simulated strokes. Humans were also used as a living test cases for grenades and flamethrowers, and prisoners were injected with inoculations of diseases disguised as vaccinations to study their effects. Because life is totally fair, Ishii was never charged with war crimes and he died peacefully at his home in Japan in the late 60s. Number 2. Joseph Mengele. Mengele gained notoriety chiefly for being one of the SS physicians who supervised the selections of arriving transports of prisoners, determining who was to be killed and who was to become a forced laborer, and for performing human experiments on camp inmates, amongst whom Mengele was known as the Angel of Death. Mengele was just a stone-cold killer as he performed experiments on 3,000 sets of twins and less than 30 survived his depraved antics. His experiments included, but sadly were not limited to, dyeing children's eyes to be a specific color since he has an obsession with monochromatic eyes, sewing twins together to make them conjoined, and giving them gangrene. In fact, many of his evil deeds weren't scientific at all. He was just masochistic. He was reportedly smiling every time he took part of his selection process of sending arrivals at camps on who were unfit for labor straight to the gas chambers. He died in 1976, and as he was never brought to justice for his crimes. Number 1. J. Marion Sims. Although he was known as the father of modern gynecology, Sims was gained much for his fame for doing experimental surgeries on slave women. Sims remained a controversial figure to this day because the condition he was treating the women, viscogenital fistula, caused terrible suffering. Women with fistulas, a tear between their private parts and their bladder, were incontinent and were often rejected by society. Sims performed the surgery without anesthesia, in part because anesthesia had only recently been discovered, and in part because Sims believed that operations were not painful enough to justify the trouble, which is what he said, but still regardless, the cruelty he bestowed on these women were not at all consented and manipulated the social institutions on slavery to perform human experiments, which by any standards is unacceptable.